The Battle of North Borneo took place during the Second World War between Allied and Japanese forces. Part of the wider Borneo campaign of the Pacific War, it was fought between the 10th of June and the 15th of August 1945 in North Borneo. The battle involved a series of amphibious landings by Australian forces on various points on the mainland around Brunei Bay and upon islands situated around the bay. Japanese opposition to the landings was sporadic initially, although as the campaign progressed a number of considerable clashes occurred and both sides suffered relatively significant casualties. Ultimately, however, the Australians were successful in seizing control of the region, although to a larger extent the strategic gains that possession of North Borneo provided the Allies with were ultimately negated by the sudden conclusion of the war in August 1945. Background. Codenamed Operation Oboe 6, the battle was part of the second phase of the Allied operations to capture the island of Borneo. Previously in May, a brigade-sized force had been put ashore on Tarakan. A total of 29,000–30,000 men were committed to the operation by the Allies, with the majority of the ground forces being provided by the Australian 9th Division, under the command of Major General George Wotton and consisting of the 20th and 24th Brigades, along with naval support from the United States Navy and Royal Australian Navy and aerial support from the United States Army Air Forces, the United States Marine Corps and elements of the Royal Australian Air Force's 1st Tactical Air Force, 2 United States Army units, the 727th Amphibian Tractor Battalion who manned the LVTs and the 593rd Engineer Boat and Shore Regiment's Boat Battalion, were also attached to the Australians, having been planned by General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Southwest Pacific Area, to take place in 3 stages: preparatory bombardment, forced landings, advance. The objective of the operation was to enable the Allies to establish an advanced fleet base in order to enable subsequent naval operations, to capture the vast oil and rubber supplies available in the area and to re-establish British civil administration. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence estimated that there were approximately 31,000 Japanese troops on Borneo, with about 8,800 of these in North Borneo. The main Japanese units in the vicinity included units of the 56th Independent Mixed Brigade, consisting of 6 battalions, along with another independent battalion. Battle. 2 main landings were undertaken by the Australians in North Borneo. The first one came on the 10th of June when troops from 2 battalions of the 24th Brigade, the 2 28th and 2 43rd Road Battalions, landed on Labuan Island with a squadron of Matilda tanks from the 2 9th Armoured Regiment, while 2 battalions of the 20th Brigade, 2 15th and 2 17th Battalions, went ashore on Muara Island and on the mainland peninsula north of Brookton, supported by a second squadron of Matildas from the 2 9th Armoured Regiment, amidst heavy naval and aerial bombardments. These landings were largely unopposed as the Japanese defenders had withdrawn from the beaches on the peninsula and Muara Island had been abandoned completely. The troops that had landed near Brookton on the mainland advanced on Brunei, which was captured on the 13th of June. The 2 20th Brigade battalions were now joined by the 2 13th Battalion, which had conducted an unopposed landing at Lutong on the 20th of June, before continuing their advance down the southwestern coast, passing through Miri and Syria on the way towards Kuching. At Syria they found and the 37 oil wells ablaze, having been deliberately lit by the Japanese defenders, and engineers from the 2/3 Road Field Company were called up to put out the fires, a task which took over 3 months to complete. Having secured its objectives, the 20th Brigade then began patrolling operations, using landing craft to move quickly along the various rivers and streams that punctuated the coastline. During the course of their involvement in the campaign, the brigade's casualties were relatively light, suffering only 40 casualties. Despite the progress that had been made on the southern mainland, however, the fighting on Labuan intensified during this time as the Japanese defenders retreated inland to a heavily fortified position known as the Pocket, and attempted to hold the Australians along the dense jungle ridges and thick swamps. Despite considerable artillery support, a company-level attack by 28th Battalion was turned back on the 14th of June, and as a result further preparatory fires were called upon to soften up the Japanese defenses. For the next 5 days an intense naval and aerial bombardment was laid down in an effort to reduce the Japanese defenses before a renewed attack was put in on the 21st of June, while the 12th Commando Squadron was given the task of clearing the outlying areas of resistance that had been bypassed during the initial advance. On the island, 2 companies of infantry from the 28th Battalion assaulted the Japanese position and, supported by indirect fire support from sea and air, and direct fire support from armor and flamethrowers, the Australians overwhelmed the Japanese defenders and cleared the remaining resistance from Labuan. After the battle, 180 Japanese dead were counted, bringing the total killed during the fighting on Labuan to 389. Against this, the Australians suffered 34 killed and 93 wounded. The second main landing came on the 16th of June on the mainland at Western, in the northeastern part of Brunei Bay. The 32nd Battalion, which had previously been held back as the divisional reserve, forced its way ashore near Padres Bay. After taking Western, patrols were sent out Beaufort, which was 23 kilometers inland. Due to the lack of roads and the indefensible nature of the railway track that led to the town, it was decided to advance along the Clears River, while a secondary force moved along the Padres River. As a part of this phase of the operation, minor landings were made at Mempakal on the 19th of June and at Sabang on the 23rd of June by elements of the 243rd Road Battalion and the 11th Commando Squadron. Kibadang was captured the same day by the 243rd Road, while the 232nd advanced further along the Padres River and the 2 battalions married up. Following this, reinforcements in the form of 2 companies from the 28th Battalion were transferred from Labuan to take over rear area security while plans were made for the main attack on Beaufort. Beaufort was believed to be held by between 800 and 1,000 Japanese troops, and on the 27th of June, the Australians attacked the town. The 243rd Road Battalion was assigned the task of the main assault, while the 232nd Battalion was tasked with flank protection. Despite being hamstrung by torrential downpour and unforgiving terrain, the 232nd Battalion secured the south bank of the Padres River, while 1 company from the 243rd Road was sent to take the town and another marched to the flanks, to take up ambush positions along the route that the Japanese were expected to withdraw along. The 28th Battalion secured the lines of communication north of the river. The resistance from the Japanese defenders was not coordinated, and as a result the Australians had secured their objectives by nightfall. Throughout the night, however, the Japanese launched 6 counterattacks which eventually broke down into hand-to-hand combat. During the course of these actions, one company became isolated and the next morning, the 28th of June, another was sent to its aid to attack the Japanese force from the rear, fighting its way through numerous Japanese positions throughout the afternoon. The company reached their objective in the early evening and launched its assault, killing at least 100 Japanese defenders. It was during the course of this action that Private Tom Starcevich of the 243rd Road Battalion performed the deeds for which he was later awarded the Victoria Cross. By the 29th of June, the Japanese began to withdraw from Beaufort in small groups. A brief pause followed while reinforcements arrived. The 2/3 Road Anti-Tank Regiment, being used as infantry rather than the anti-tank role for which they were intended, arrived at Weston on the 3rd of July, where it relieved the 228th Battalion, which then moved on to Beaufort. On the 6th of July the Australian advance was resumed. Due to the strategic situation, it was decided to undertake a slow and cautious advance using indirect fire to limit casualties. By the 12th of July the 232nd Battalion occupied Papa, and from the patrols were dispatched to the north and along the banks of the river as offensive operations came to an end. Aftermath. Following the capture of Papa, the Australians ceased offensive actions on Borneo and the situation remained largely static until a ceasefire came into effect in mid-August. In early August 1945, 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and on the 15th of August the Japanese Emperor Hirohito effectively announced an end to hostilities, with the formal surrender being signed on the 2nd of September 1945. As a result of the ceasefire, the planned Allied invasion of Japan was no longer required, and as a result, the strategic gains provided by the capture of North Borneo were arguably negated. To some extent, this has led to claims in Australia that the Obo operations, as well as the campaigns in the Itape-Wewak region of New Guinea and on Bougainville and New Britain, had been unnecessary, and had therefore resulted in needless casualties. Throughout the course of the fighting on North Borneo, the Australians lost 114 men killed or died of wounds, while another 221 men were wounded. Against this, the Japanese lost at least 1,234 men, while 130 had been captured. On top of this, a further 1,800 Japanese were estimated to have been killed by guerrilla forces operating as part of the Clandestine Services Reconnaissance Department. After the fighting was over, the Australians began the task for establishing British civil administration, rebuilding the infrastructure that had been damaged and providing for the civilians that had been displaced in the fighting. Following the ceasefire, there were still a large number of Japanese troops in North Borneo. By October 1945, it was estimated that there were over 21,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians still in North Borneo, and the 9th Division was made responsible for organizing the surrender, provisioning and protection of these personnel. They were also tasked with liberating the Allied civilian internees and prisoners of war that were being held at Batu Lintang camp in Kuching, Sarawak. As civil administration was slowly restored, in October 1945, the Australian demobilisation process began. Initially this process was slow as there were few troops able to relieve the Australian forces in Borneo, and as such only long-service personnel were released for return to Australia. The 9th Division remained in North Borneo performing garrison duties until January 1946, when it was relieved by the 32nd Indian Brigade, and subsequently disbanded. For the majority of the 9th Division's personnel, a return to civilian life followed. However, as part of Australia's contribution to the occupation of Japan, a number of men from the 9th Division were transferred to the 67th Battalion, which was being formed as part of the 34th Brigade. Such was the relationship formed between the 9th Division and the civilian population of North Borneo, that the division's unit colour patch was incorporated into the coat of arms of the colony of British Borneo following the war, remaining as such until 1963, when the region was subsumed by the Malaysian state of Sabah.